is actually an explanation for why he did so. Because Judge Boasberg did know one thing. He knew that Jack Smith was a partisan Democrat engaged in an effort to go after Donald Trump, that he was subpoenaing over 400 Republicans. So the one thing he knew is all of these targets were Republicans. So the only conceivable basis for Judge Boasberg signing these orders one after the other is an animus that says every Republican on planet Earth, every American who voted for Donald Trump.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to America Wake. I'm Wilson. The clip you just watched raises a question that should concern every American. How can anyone challenge a government action if they never even know it happened? What stood out to me was Ted Cruz's focus on accountability. This wasn't just about politics. It was about whether judges and government officials are following the law and whether Americans have a fair chance to defend their rights when government power is used against them. No matter where you stand politically, transparency and accountability should matter to all of us. And after watching this hearing, I think there are some serious questions that deserve answers. Before we get into it, hit that like button, subscribe to America Wake, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest coverage of the stories shaping America. Now let's watch the full video.
Let's start with Judge Boasberg. Professor Luther, is it consistent with the judge's oath of office to sign an order for which there is zero basis in law and zero basis in fact?
Absolutely not.
Is it consistent with a judge's oath to do whatever a prosecutor asks him without inquiring as to the facts or the law?
It's completely inconsistent.
Judge Boasberg signed multiple orders. I'm holding one of them in my hand. That's his signature at the bottom. Ordering the phone companies who'd been subpoenaed not to disclose to the members of the Senate and the members of the House that their phone records had been subpoenaed. As you noted in your testimony, that order is directly contrary to federal statute. Congress in 2004 made it illegal for a phone company to disclose a senator's phone records without notifying the senator in question. Is there any basis for a judge to disregard unambiguous federal statutory language?
Absolutely not.
Judge Boasberg signed an order that says, quote, "The court finds reasonable grounds to believe that such disclosure," in other words, informing the senators their phone records had been subpoenaed, "will result in the destruction of or tampering with evidence, intimidation of potential witnesses, and serious jeopardy to the investigation." Is there any conceivable basis for Judge Boasberg signing that, particularly given Jack Smith's testimony now that Judge Boasberg had no idea whose phone records he was signing off on?
I've been struggling for the last few weeks to come up with one, but I can't. And I'll mention we wouldn't even know about this if it weren't for Chairman Grassley's oversight efforts.
That is true. And Professor Vladeck, you suggested the remedy for an erroneous decision is appeal. Judge Boasberg signed a secret non-disclosure order that was ex parte with only the Department of Justice in front of him. Is there any conceivable universe in which anyone could appeal that?
So, Senator, as you know, there are circumstances in which the providers can decline to comply. Indeed, I believe in one of the cases, Verizon actually said it was not going to comply with the NDO. I believe that's part of the record as well. And those orders are themselves also subject to challenge in court. Now, Senator, you and I have had this conversation for a long time about how there are lots of gaps in federal law when it comes to the targets of surveillance not being able to object.
Did the targets of surveillance know about this?
No, but I would also remind...
Could the senators whose records were subpoenaed, contrary to federal law, appeal it?
So, no, but of course, Judge Boasberg didn't know, first, that these were senators, second, that their
nor did
communications were covered
Professor
by
Vladeck, nor did he inquire. And in fact, I'm going to go back to Professor Luther's statement, because in an ordinary circumstance, a judge entering an order that he doesn't know who it's applying to, he doesn't know any facts, he doesn't know anything, on the ordinary basis, you'd say, yeah, there's zero basis in fact, but there is actually an explanation for why he did so. Because Judge Boasberg did know one thing. He knew that Jack Smith was a partisan Democrat engaged in an effort to go after Donald Trump, that he was subpoenaing over 400 Republicans. So the one thing he knew is all of these targets were Republicans. So the only conceivable basis for Judge Boasberg signing these orders one after the other is an animus that says every Republican on planet Earth, every American who voted for Donald Trump, there is reasonable basis to believe they are criminals.
Senator,
I'm done with your question.
I'm sorry.
There is no other basis for his signing that order. He knew that. He knew Jack Smith. Welcome to the fast food counter at McDonald's. Whatever you want, all the fries you want, I will sign, ordered. That is perfectly fine if you are the chairman of the DNC. Being a partisan hack, or for that matter, the chairman of the RNC, either side can be partisan hacks. Judges are expected not to be. And I would point out this is a pattern we've seen before for 4 years during the Biden DOJ. We saw the Department of Justice refuse to enforce the law when violent protesters were outside the homes of Supreme Court justices. It was directly contrary to 18 U.S.C. Section 1507. It was a felony on national television being committed over and over again, and Merrick Garland, a rogue partisan attorney general, refused to enforce the law. Why? Because he supported the objectives of the protesters. That kind of hypocrisy, let me be clear, I would object to an order that found Democrat members of the Senate, absent real and meaningful evidence, were likely to be criminals. That's what Judge Boasberg signed off on.
After watching that entire exchange, I think Ted Cruz raised some very important points. The biggest issue for me is not even the political angle. It's the process. Cruz kept coming back to one simple fact. The people whose records were subpoenaed didn't know it was happening. If that's true, then they had no chance to challenge it in court. That creates a serious problem because we're often told that if a court makes a mistake, the solution is to appeal. But how can you appeal something you never knew existed? That was one of the strongest moments of the hearing. Another thing that stood out was the discussion about federal law. Cruz argued that there were legal protections that should have required notification. If those protections were ignored, people have every right to ask why. What I found interesting was that Cruz kept asking what evidence justified the secrecy orders. What evidence showed that notifying these individuals would lead to destroyed evidence or witness intimidation? The answers didn't seem very clear, and that only raised more questions. At its core, this hearing was about trust. Can Americans trust that judges are carefully reviewing government requests? Can Americans trust that powerful institutions are applying the law fairly? Can Americans trust that surveillance powers are not being abused? Those are important questions regardless of political party. I also think Cruz was speaking to a concern many Americans have. People want to know that government agencies, prosecutors, and judges are applying the same standards to everyone. When that confidence starts to fade, public trust suffers. What made Cruz effective here was that he stayed focused on accountability. He wasn't just talking about outcomes. He was asking who knew what evidence existed, and whether proper procedures were followed. Now, critics will argue that secrecy can sometimes be necessary during investigations. That's a fair point. But when the government exercises power behind closed doors, there should also be strong safeguards and oversight. The more authority government officials have, the more important transparency becomes. For me, that's why this exchange mattered. Ted Cruz forced a conversation about judicial oversight, surveillance, and accountability. Whether you agree with every argument he made or not, those are issues worth examining closely. At the end of the day, no judge, prosecutor, or government official should be above scrutiny. That's how accountability works, and that's how public trust is maintained. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Ted Cruz raised valid concerns, or do you see it differently? I'm Wilson, this is America Wake, and I'll see you in the next video.